So our last item on the agenda is a panel discussion on the city's emergency housing response, and we do have three guest speakers. We're going to start with Elena Landrisina, who is a human rights lawyer for the Legal Aid Society. And also, I just want to share the name of this panel that we came up with is Systems of Care, a look at the city's emergency housing response and ideas for advocacy. So we're hoping to really just get insights from people who are really on the ground, just giving first response help to unsheltered people in New York. And thank you so much for joining us and making time for, an evening on Zoom. And hi, Erin, I see you now. Thank you for joining us. So we'll start with you, Elena. I believe you can share your screen. Do you have any trouble finding that button?
I've never done it before, but I'll try it. I see the button, so I'll give it a try. But thank you. Let me try now. Sorry.
Yep, that's working.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Elena Landrisina. I live in Sheepshead Bay, and I'm currently working at the Legal Aid Society, but I just want to make clear that I'm speaking in my personal capacity as an advocate and a lawyer, not on behalf of Legal Aid. So I figured I would focus my remarks on why shelters are important and why to support them, and what we can do to support residents of shelters. I'm sharing my experience having worked primarily in the civil rights field on disability justice issues, as well as issues involving the criminal legal system. So that's my background. And I, at the outset, wanted to just give some principles that orient me on this issue. The first is that I very much believe that housing is a human right, and that housing, as we've seen during COVID, is healthcare. That without housing, without the safety of housing, people couldn't really keep themselves safe. So that's the first orienting principle. The second is that I very much believe in applying abolitionist principles to the work that I do. And so I excerpted this really excellent quote from an article written by Crystal Okafor and Sophie House that ties abolition to housing justice. And I think that as a movement, abolition asks us to kind of interrogate the connections between systems that further punishment. So how do systems work to marginalize people, to criminalize and dehumanize people, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people with disabilities? It's also, on the more positive side, it's about how do you build community-based power, and how do you empower people to be people who are directly impacted by these practices, by discriminatory practices. How do you empower those communities? So with that background, I think the question for me, and maybe for some of you, is if housing is the solution to homelessness, and if housing is a human right, shouldn't we be demanding housing and not shelter? Because that's something that I kind of wrestle with in my approach to this issue. And so why are we advocating for more shelters to be built in our neighborhoods when what we want is more housing, more permanent housing, and more services? And I think it's important to acknowledge the difference between housing and shelter. And so I pulled up some characteristics of housing. There's stability, there's self-determination and autonomy. People have privacy in their home, and they have legal rights. They have rights as tenants. Shelter doesn't offer that. Shelter is, I mean, it's housing. It's literally having shelter over your head, but there are many aspects to being in the shelter system that are coercive, that are disempowering, that are disruptive to community connections, because while you're in the shelter system, you as an individual don't have a right to be placed at any particular shelter, although there is a legal right in New York City to be provided with shelter. You don't necessarily have very much say over where those services are provided. There are rules and curfews to being in a shelter. So there are many features of being in a shelter system that I think it's important to acknowledge, like really distinguish it from housing, which is what we really want for people. At the same time, there's a tremendous need for shelter in the city. And I pulled some of the statistics that the Department of Homeless Services has on their website from last week. So about over 50,000 people are currently in the shelter system. That includes about 14,000 adult men. The statistics are really stark. So I think we have a moral obligation to provide shelter to people and to address people's most basic needs. I think one of the other panelists is an advocate at Vocal. Groups like Vocal and other advocacy groups are doing amazing work trying to change at the local and state level how public services can be funded. So redirecting public resources to housing, education, social services, healthcare. So those are really important campaigns to follow and really important initiatives. But until that vision of those services exist, we do still need to address the need for housing that exists today. So I wanted to just contextualize that as a way of saying that I do think we need to be supportive, or my view is that we should support shelters in our neighborhoods. And we should also, though, reflect on the importance of where those shelters are located. So historically, and because where shelters are located is tied into giving people their best chance to be successful and to be able to move out of the shelter system and into permanent housing of their own. So historically, and many people may know this, the city has located shelters in neighborhoods that have suffered through decades of neglect and disinvestment, and that's as a result of a multitude of different government policies. This has really been chronic neglect, and primarily experienced by communities of color. And you can see this across many different metrics. So I, in preparation for this panel, I did a search, and it's not very hard to find that these patterns exist when you look at housing insecurity or food insecurity or the rate of policing. It tends to fall in the same neighborhoods that are predominantly communities of color. And so you can then easily guess where the homeless shelters have been often located. It's in these same neighborhoods that are highly policed and starved of resources. So I think that an abolitionist approach to the issue of shelters requires us to recognize the racism that has led to these conditions in our city, and then to really support the city's initiatives to locate shelters in neighborhoods that are better resourced or more resourced than the ones that have historically been the locations for shelters. And I don't think that supporting those initiatives necessarily means that we lose sight of the goal of housing and the fact that housing is a human right. It just means that we make sure that we're caring for the people who are in need right now. So finally, I wanted to give a bit of a case study about what happens when there's a lack of housing. And frankly, the regressive methods that government agencies employ to respond to the lack of housing and services, because it illustrates how interconnected mass incarceration is to the lack of housing and to the lack of mental health services. And again, it reinforces to me why it's important to locate shelters in areas where people have the best opportunities to be successful. So this chart is my attempt to kind of illustrate a case that I'm working on right now. I'm one of the attorneys in a lawsuit that concerns people with mental illness who required supportive housing or some sort of housing with services when they were when they returned to the community. And because no housing existed, the state prison system kept them confined beyond the end of their prison sentences. And when we brought litigation to challenge this practice, the state responded by just releasing people into the shelter system. And these were releases without the housing availability in the near term. This was without services like care coordination, robust care coordination that many individuals need. And so once placed into the homeless shelter, which can be a chaotic and disruptive environment for anyone, and placed there for a long period of time, the risk that someone is going to deteriorate is really heightened. And add to that the fact that these shelters, in the case of the individuals that I work with, many people are exiting the prison system and they're going to be on some period of community supervision. And if you've read Michelle Alexander's book about the new Jim Crow, you understand the concept of the proliferation of the prison industrial complex being these different systems of correctional control. So it's not just that people are incarcerated in prisons, but that once they leave the physical brick and mortar prison, they're still under some sort of correctional control and supervision, and that at any moment you can really easily be swept back into the system. So these are our clients who, the clients that I work with are people who are often on parole and are having to manage being in the shelter system because there's no housing, and they're required to be there for extended periods of time because there's no housing. And all during that period, they're on parole, situated in shelters that are located in neighborhoods that are highly policed, that are starved of food security and health resources. And I laid out a few factors that I've just encountered about why stays in the shelter system persist for so long. There are no vouchers for people to move and to get subsidies that really can be applied to the types of rents that we see in the city. There's stigma, so private landlords don't want to rent to people based on source of income or criminal history, criminal justice history. So people's stays in the shelter system get prolonged, and they're perpetually at risk of either deteriorating because it's difficult to cope in the system, which may lead them to hospitalization, or of having trouble with parole and managing their parole conditions, which would lead back to incarceration. So I use this as an example to just give broader context for why, like, not only must we care about housing and the availability and affordability of housing, but we need to understand how this is connected to a shelter system and to the deficiencies in how we operate a shelter system also are problematic. But what we can do, at least as a little measure, is support the initiatives to locate shelters in neighborhoods that at least have some degree of resources for people who need them. So I wanted to end on a more positive note of what we can do. I think it's really important in legal work in any sort of field to really, or not a field in particular, but to always be mindful that the people who are most directly impacted need to be the people directing and having agency about what solutions make most sense. And so to the extent that we have opportunities to connect with directly impacted people, to people in the shelter system, to people who've dealt with housing insecurity, food insecurity, those are the people who should be leading us in what we can do as supportive neighbors. DHS a few years ago announced that they have a community advisory board policy that I don't really know the ins and outs of how it works, but I think that's an opportunity for us, if we live near a shelter, to be to volunteer to be part of the community advisory board and lend whatever support we can offer. I think even in an informal way, we can be neighbors and unite together and challenge racism and NIMBYism. I think it's really important that we appreciate that a lot of the pushback against shelters is rooted in racism and stereotypes about mental illness. And we'll see, I see this all the time, the concern is like, oh, these people in the shelter have mental illness, they're going to do us harm or they're going to commit crime. What we need to realize is that the people who live in shelters are actually more in danger from our neighbors who are racist and ableist. And if there are things that we can do to intercept the threat of violence that could be posed to the shelter residents, that's what should be, I think, preoccupying us as concerned citizens. And I added too, I mean, there are so many different campaigns going on. Currently, there's a Less is More campaign, which is about parole justice. There are housing justice campaigns about trying to increase the amount of vouchers so that people can actually move out of the shelter system and be able to afford renting an apartment or housing. And then there's the Fair Chance for Housing campaign, which is about trying to eliminate the ability to discriminate based on history in the criminal legal system. But there's so many more, and I'm sure other panelists might also be able to speak to the initiatives. I think everything that Vocal does, I think, is amazing, and I would support following their work because it's so crucial. And I included some resources for anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. If you don't mind sending us the deck or sending this document with these links, that would be so great. We can share it to our members via our discussion group, our Facebook discussion group, and in our newsletter. Thank you. And I just want to apologize. I actually meant to start this panel with Celina Trowell from Vocal New York, but the way Zoom worked, when Celina had logged in, she was under my name and I just got confused. I had no idea what was going on. But so sorry about that. But Celina, thank you so much. I see you now. So yeah, you have the floor. Please tell us about your work or what you care about. and how we can help.
Absolutely. So I just want to say good evening. Thank you for having me. I just want to say thank you, Elena. That was a very beautiful and thorough presentation. I want to say hello to Erin and everybody here tonight. And also apologize because I am not as prepared as Elena, but luckily I got past some cheat notes. So I'm going to just go honestly off those notes to kind of lead and guide the conversation. And for a full disclaimer, I get stage fright talking, so this never gets easier, even on Zoom. Okay, so if I talk too fast, feel free to tell me to slow down or repeat myself, but at the end of the day, so I'm working on it. Okay, so yeah, my name is Celina Trowell. I am the Homelessness Union organizer at Vocal New York. And so Vocal New York is a grassroots membership led organization that fights to end mass incarceration, the war on drugs, homelessness, AIDS, and HIV. We do that through advocacy. We do that through political engagement and building power to make sure that we can push for political policies and responses to where we see that there are political failures in our system in which the people most vulnerable suffer, and that's predominantly Black and Brown. So our membership is predominantly Black and Brown. We are a Black and Brown led membership organization. And so in terms of, you know, my thoughts on the overall structure of the New York City shelter system. If it's one thing about me, I will always be very honest about the nuances, right? Like, and so I think that's just one of the beauties of being able to be on a space and even be a part of this panel, because while we all make work from different perspectives, there's all nuances in this work, right? And so all of the panelists here, like, we all have a goal in mind to keep people safe and to get them housed, right? And approach is different, right? And thoughts and theories of change may be different with that. So just in terms of like the overall structure, you know, what we're seeing right now based on the numbers, and I'm like grateful that Elena, you showed that, but like based on the numbers, like we see that we have a housing crisis, we have a homelessness crisis, and we have to name that housing justice is innately racial justice. And I think that comes from a very long history, decades of disinvestment in communities intentionally. And we still deal with that and struggle with how to navigate throughout those spaces. This shelter system as it is, there's a purpose for it, right? Let me just be very clear and say that when it first came about, it was a strong need. It was a different time. And so I also do feel like, you know, for anybody, I hate economics, but for anybody who is really into it, when we talk about like the law of diminishing returns, I think that we have to acknowledge that we're in that space where there you know, there was a goal, right? There was a need to address back in the 70s and 80s, right? The different time and era in our city. And I think, you know, the city worked really hard to do all that they could to put all the resources out there to address those issues. I think what tends to happen over time, and just with any capitalist society or bureaucracy, right? These things start to become monetized, right? And these things in our city starts to become overburdened, right? Population starts to increase. We start to go back and forth, pull in and out of policies, disinvest in communities in a really intentional, deliberate way, which then overburdens the system, right? So I want to acknowledge that, right? Like that you pull out resources meant to benefit people, then the system can't do what it needs to do to adequately to do just that. And then there's a struggle because the people who need it the most will always continue to advocate for the things that are needed. And then we also have an expectation that this thing provide those things no matter what. And so, you know, the law of diminishing returns on like that return on investment right now, what we're seeing is that shelters are not safe. We are seeing that the resources that were meant to be put in place oftentimes are not being provided to the extent that I'm certain it was designed and hoped to be able to provide, but can't, unfortunately. So many people slip through the cracks. And so that being said, you know, we also have that with the housing crisis where there's honestly nowhere for people to go. And so as an organizer, when I'm building power and I'm talking with people who are directly impacted by this, I've also had lived experiences working in a shelter as a case manager. So I've been able to see that side, I've been able to understand the politics, the bureaucracy of that. And then also know that we're sending people out into a space where there just is not enough adequate, safe, affordable housing for people, right? And one of the things, and it's never just enough just to shift somebody into a room, right? It's never just enough to shift somebody into, you know, like a hotel. Like one of the things that we talk about at Vocal, and the reason why we are very intentional about calling ourselves the Homeless Union and naming homelessness is because a roof over your head doesn't mean you have a home. And so, you know, there's different terms out there in how we address the issue. But the point is, people need to be in a space where they feel that their heart is connected to, where they feel like they have the safety and the dignity and security. And that's what makes it a home. And so, you know, like, honestly, that, you know, would be my take on where the structure of the city, the city's shelter system is right now, and then how that basically connects to like the emergency response system. I think like what we have in place is amazing. Like, I think we're probably one of the only or few states where we have a right to shelter. Like no other state has that, like, you know, something like of that nature. And I think that's amazing. However, like I said, in terms of law of diminishing returns at this point, we need to really start to think about and reimagine how we can transition the city and state to a right to housing, right? You know, for example, and to hold those nuances, our brothers and sisters and siblings upstate, they don't even have right to shelter, right? And so that's something to even consider. Like that's a city-based thing that we talk about. But upstate New York is, you know, you get dropped off a bus from a prison or a jail, then you're either like in a bus station, or you're in a hotel, or you're in the street, or you're praying that you catch a bus to somebody's couch, right? So that's what I mean when I say that in terms of immediate response, emergency response to this crisis, like you can understand how there is a place for that. But then what happens to the individuals who have, you know, cycled in and out of homelessness for so long because this city has not budgeted the proper resources to take care of people? What happens to individuals who have been holding vouchers for 1 to 2 to 3 years because we know that they can only afford a room, right? But that's not dignity, right? Like people should be able to have their own home, a full apartment, right? With amenities, right? And so we're at this space where, again, when we talk about resources, for example, one of the things that Elena has shared was Intro 146, which is the city VEPS voucher, right? And one of the things that voucher does, for example, is increases the city VEPS voucher to fair market rate so that it can be competitive out there. Because one of the things that we know that many people are dealing with in terms of being in shelter and receiving those vouchers is that there's a lot of source of income discrimination that happens, and for various reasons over the decades, right? Vouchers don't work, they're not enough, property value has gone up, so you know, landlords are not willing to accept it. And then you also have stigma that is attached to people coming from the shelter. All those things play into why it makes it hard to house people, even with available vouchers, right? And so there's many people that are still sitting and having to deal with, especially in this pandemic, how do I even go about doing active housing search, let alone if you have access to Wi-Fi to do that. And then on top of that, having to convince the landlord to please take something that may be below what they need to survive right now, because they may be on the brink of homelessness themselves, right? So it's a very nasty cycle that that is perpetuating, and we're seeing that, and COVID-19 is only exacerbating, you know, that issue. And so like that, you know, like that, even that leads perfectly into, you know, this COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing across the state tens of thousands of households that are being threatened right now with homelessness. Like that is a nightmare. People are losing sleep, stressed out, taking different trajectories of life because of how they can cope with this fear of being homeless. All the while we already have across the state about 92,000 people who are already homeless. And we're not counting, when I say 92,000, we don't necessarily count the ones that are in the street. We don't count the ones that are couch surfing. We're not necessarily counting the ones that go in and out of this, shelter system consistently throughout a week. Like maybe they just need a bed for a night, then they go back somewhere else. We're not counting the, the ones that stay on the street. So just imagine what that looks like, coupled with an entire state and just across the nation, honestly, people who are in fear and can't pay their rent and don't know what's going to happen once this eviction moratorium ends in terms of the state. And so what we have also seen too is when, I don't have the direct numbers, but the numbers have continued to be consistent in terms of who this is impacting the most. That's Black, brown, poor, and undocumented indigenous immigrant communities still. And it is consistent. And what we saw, especially during the onset of this pandemic, in terms of the influx of people that began to come into the shelter for the very first time, it was a lot of those people that represented those different groups of, populations. And so right now, what needs to, while we have this thing kind of flipped on its head and we're looking at the really grotesque underbelly of what this has brought to us, like we really have to we have to have the political will. And that's one of the things that Vocal New York really, really pushes for. We fight and we say that we fight, but we fight because we're right. And the housing is a human right, period. And we agree with that across the board. Everybody is housing ready. And when we talk about the word ready should be honestly contingent upon whatever level that is. There should be something available for you, but you shouldn't have to live your life in a shelter where you have to deal with the carceral response, where you have to feel institutionalized by those things. Like in my experience, I've worked in family shelters where things can be, I would say, for lack of better terms, more lax, but we're still asking family with children to sign in and sign out, ask for night passes if they want to work late at night, be able to show a pay stub and sign over, like a money order, and like, these things, right? And we don't understand the impact that this has, even by staying 3 months and have to experience something like that, what that can do to a person's mental health, and then how that also exacerbates and can deteriorate one's mental health and psyche, and then force an even longer stay in the shelter system because we perpetuate what looks like the very same institution that oppresses us. And so, I think like Elena, you raised a good point in terms of how we deal with what's happening right now internally, like in the shelter system. How do we address those human right needs and the dignity? Like that needs a complete overhaul, of not just a complete removal. At some point, like we need to worry about and focus and put energy on how do we shift these systems to no longer need to exist. And it can't be a matter of individuals worried about the fact that their career or their job is tied to it. There's enough work in this society for us to do and fix, but we need to move into that next phase, and not have our paychecks necessarily dependent upon the oppression of other people when it comes to housing, right? And I feel very strongly and unapologetic about that, having been somebody who paycheck depended on how many people I can move out a month. You know what I mean? And having to feel that pressure. And, like one of the unique things about that was I actually worked in the neighborhood in which I lived. So on the weekends, I was dealing with and seeing people who, had I not ever knew they were in the shelter, I would have considered my neighbor. And I did, right? I was just one of those people. I was just one of those, it wasn't going to change for me, but that wasn't always the case with my colleagues. That wasn't always the case with community members and how receptive they were to it. That wasn't always the case with community boards and how receptive they were, because, there is a notion that, that shelters, while shelters are unwanted in certain neighborhoods, so are the people. And so how do we move past that? How do we build past that? And for example, I can always use like when I want to talk about like the nuances, maybe, because I think one of the things here was, like how can we best advocate for residents and like, local shelters and be more supportive and build and support them. I think it's an understanding that it's clear, the statistics are clear that some communities happen to be a favorite of the city when it comes to where they want to place shelters. And I think, one, we have to be honest and name that sometimes the pushback from that is the fact that there are communities who are like tapped and just disinvested and just rolled over so much that you're literally breaking a levee by adding another shelter. Like I live in a community where we're talking, we have about 13, 14 plus shelters and hotels, whereas some have never seen one. But we have to then be able to shift our focus in the community, not on the people, because oftentimes not those same people come from our community. They are us. But what are we doing to ensure that this system is having a political will to engage in proper, affordable housing for people to feel safe, to have the dignity, to afford, right? So we're mad at the people, right? Or we may be mad at the facility, but are we pressing our elected officials? Are we pressing the city agencies to do what they have to do to create housing, to convert spaces, to do what needs to be done to ensure that we are housing people, right? We have, you know, the lotteries, which are a joke oftentimes in these communities, because that's just another avenue and pathway for gentrification, right? We have laws that need to continue to get flipped on their head in terms of like basement apartments or certain things like that. Vouchers, for example, making sure we have vouchers that actually work, right? And making sure that our elected officials are properly funding those type of programs to make sure that they work. We understand that, you know, it's the whole thing. But we just have to be mindful and understanding sometimes where that can come from. And then also being able to call out and name that when some, you know, like feelings start to get hurt because there's a sense of entitlement, that NIMBYism, where you've never had to experience this before, or people no longer look like you in your communities. And then you start to go off on these tropes, racist, classist tropes. Those are the things that we have to come together and push back on, but also constantly check within ourselves how we're engaging with the shelters that are right in our backyards. How are we having those conversations? How are we welcoming those community members? How are we bringing them in? How are we engaging them to feel as if they have a voice and they're a part of our community? Because the gag is up. They, you know, while the idea is for folks to come in and leave within 3 months, they'll be there for a year or more, especially with the way the housing market is looking, especially by the time they have to get settled in and then settle in their mind the fact that they have 4 walls to stare at and have to get past their mental health in order to deal with that. You know, I've seen people come in on a path and deteriorate, and therefore engage and consume the institution, you know, the carceral and institutionalizing that happens to you. And that's rough and tough. And so it's hard to sit with a case manager every 2 weeks and try to say, I haven't, you know, no, I haven't done a housing search. And no, I'm not coming here to meet to sign another ILP or put my name on something. It gets exhausting after a while. And we're repressing people and we're stretching them too thin. And that's what I mean when I say the law of diminishing returns. At this point, it was going good, but now what we're getting back from it is people who are institutionalized, people who are harmed, people who no longer feel safe, people who are stripped of their agency, having to come into the shelter system and become just a number. And then people within that system who have then become deputized and will treat you less than because they have a check and you don't, or their job depends on how they treat you. Hopefully I haven't spoken too much or spoken over my time, but I think those may be some of the points, you know, just overall and based on the cheat sheet that I can touch for now. And I'm, you know, I guess towards the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. I guess if I could just briefly say some of the things or just piggyback, you know, introducing but supporting legislation like Intro 146 is major. for us, and one of the things that we're fighting for. Ensuring that homeless adults and adult families have access to Wi-Fi, especially in this pandemic, where everything has transitioned to digital. People can't even search for housing if they have no access. And we know that that may be a budget thing, but we also know that a lot of these hotels and shelters are already equipped with Wi-Fi. It's just a matter of giving a password and strengthening the broadband access. That's in the building already. There's really no excuse. People need to eat, engage with their doctors, look for housing, look for employment, contact and be engaged with their community and loved ones. So, access to Wi-Fi, increasing the City Fab's voucher, pushing for what is called the Housing Access Voucher Program, which is a statewide Section 8-like voucher program that will cover the whole state and also include people who are undocumented and on Social Security disability, because those individuals are often left behind in the shelter system, because if you're not on public assistance, you don't qualify for City Fabs. So that leaves many of our elders and many of our undocumented family in the shelter system and left behind. And so those are just some of the few things off the top of my head that I can share, in terms of action and advocacy. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Celina. You were great, and you did not show any stage fright at all. So thank you so much for just speaking to your experience. Just one thing that just really stands out, it's going to stand out in my head for a long time, is the fact that you worked in a shelter in your neighborhood, and considering the residents of the shelter your neighbors as being something that was unique, that you did not see that neighborly concern among other community members and your other neighbors. We're going to go ahead and give the floor to Erin Drinkwater. Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I don't know if I have your full role correct here. You're the Deputy Commissioner of the Intergovernmental and Legislative Affairs Department. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Yes, thank you, good evening. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Elena and Celina, for your presentations. I'd like to start out by saying I was at a meeting just prior to this with Community Board 2 in Manhattan. And I so appreciate the thoughtful conversation taking place here. The meeting that I was in with CB2 was about siting a shelter in their community. It is in the heart of Soho, and talking about areas who have historically not hosted and been privy to shelters. Hearing and listening to the responses is oftentimes hurtful and frustrating and overwhelming. I appreciate a lot of the sentiments that have been shared by our two speakers earlier, in terms of some of the reform that needs to take place in terms of centering the individuals and the individuals' humanity who are in our care in the shelter system. I agree, housing is a human right. I also agree that, much like hospital emergency rooms, shelters operate as sort of a safety net to the safety net. And I appreciate the sentiment of figuring out ways for groups like yourselves to support shelters, to participate in cabs. I'm happy to explain that process later. Elena, I'm very happy that you raised that. I will say that one of the hardest things in my job, I oversee a small but mighty team of borough directors who engage in community relations and government relations as it relates to the siting of shelters. So we go out and speak to communities who are both incredibly overburdened by the footprint of DHS in their community, and communities who have never seen a homeless shelter in their time. Those conversations have woven throughout them similarities and stark differences. And I give my team a lot of credit for doing the work that they do you know, speaking truth about clients' experiences, the necessity to provide programs and services, but those conversations are very challenging. And so to step into a space like this where there is a thoughtful discussion about how to support clients and also how to transform the system, right? How to imagine a world where housing is the first and best option because we know that to be true. And shelter is something that a small subset of individuals might need to use for a smaller period of time. I want to talk a little bit about the mayor's Turning the Tide plan and the work that has taken place over this administration. So I work for the Department of Social Services, which is the umbrella agency over both the Human Resources Administration and the Department of Homeless Services. I interact both on the HRA side, which administers a multitude of public programs, including cash assistance, SNAP, the Domestic Violence Shelter System, the HASA, which is HIV/AIDS Services Administration Shelter System, Adult Protective Services, the Emergency Food Program, which you know has been quite impacted this past year, as have all of our programs. The agency also administers IDNYC and the Office of Civil Justice, which is an initiative under this administration where we provide free legal services to tenants who are in housing court in need of support. On the DHS side, working to administer the shelter program as well as our street outreach program. So in 2017, the mayor issued Turning the Tide, which was really the city's first ever comprehensive plan to address homelessness. Prior to this, the shelter system had built up in a really haphazard way over many decades since the right to shelter was first won through a series of legal victories in the courts. As was noted, we're not the only jurisdiction with a right to shelter, but we are by far the largest and the most comprehensive jurisdiction. And I think that's important to note because, as has been mentioned, you know, locations that do not have a right to shelter, you know, see very different representations of what individuals experiencing homelessness are in the communities. We saw the tragedy of a large homeless encampment in LA recently swept by the LAPD and others. And, you know, we've seen other examples where individuals are doubled up or in very unsafe housing conditions because of the lack of any other option, including, you know, being faced with the severe weather in the cold. So the Turning the Tide plan really took a look at, you know, what are the drivers of homelessness? What can we do in terms of transforming the shelter delivery, and looking at you know, housing options as it relates to social services tool. Intro 146 was mentioned, which relates to the city FHEP's rental assistance program. But the mayor's plan really is based on 4 pillars, which is preventing homelessness wherever we can. That includes, as I mentioned, the Office of Civil Justice, which provides attorneys in housing court. Through the first in the nation Right to Counsel program, we drove down evictions by more than 40%. Obviously, all eyes are on what's happening right now in terms of the fact that we have the eviction moratorium. And we recognize that, you know, tens of thousands of New Yorkers have been unable to pay their rent either in part or in whole over the course of this past year. And so certainly paying attention to that, our teams have adjusted. And so that way court cases that are moving through the courts, we're able to provide attorneys in those cases, as opposed to the approach that we had throughout the past couple of years, which was a zip code implementation-based approach. So we recognize as the court is adjusting the ways in which that they're doing their work, we want to be able to adjust with our providers. So that way we are ensuring that tenants who are moving through, whose cases are moving through housing court have access to attorneys. Also incredibly important, some of the provisions that have been included in the various stimulus packages that have been passed, including the emergency rental assistance monies that were allocated both directly to New York City as well as to New York State. We've been in ongoing negotiations and discussing with the state legislature how those monies will be allocated. So that way New York City is able to access the state allocation as well as an additive to what the city was directly allocated from the federal government. We've also expanded Home Base, which is a community-based program. There are 26 locations throughout the city. This is in an effort to connect individuals who have housing, but are, housing insecure because they can't, meet their rent obligations. They're having challenges with their landlord. They're being harassed, and making sure that those individuals are able to be connected through community-based organizations to get connected to things like rental assistance, the payment of rental arrears or utility arrears. If individuals need mediation, tenant-landlord mediation, and that sort of thing, but really focused on if an individual has housing, what can we do to preserve that housing? How can we make sure that somebody does not have to leave that housing? Is it an attorney? Is it paying back rent? What is it? We have paid both an increased single issuance of back rent payments, and that represents just the skyrocketing of rents across New York City, but we've also paid more rent arrears than previous administrations. So again, sort of, making the benefits that should be and are available to New Yorkers truly available to New Yorkers who are in need. We also stood up at the start of this administration, rebuilding the rental assistance program. Between 2011 and 2014, when the state and city funded Advantage program was discontinued, we saw homelessness increase by 40% just over that short period of time. We saw homelessness increase by 115% between 1994 and 2014, the start of this administration. And so reestablishing a rental assistance program was incredibly important because we know that when we can provide people rent assistance, again, it keeps people in their home, it allows some stability in their lives. And Elena, just some of the points that you talked about, it disrupts the sort of decompensation that we can see when folks are facing instability for any number of reasons, and the consistent and persistent worry that people have in their lives when they're not sure where their next rent check is going to come from, where their next check to pay the groceries and bills are going to come from. So we know that's incredibly important. Under this administration, we also reinstated the set-asides for NYCHA to ensure that there were direct linkages between the agencies, so that way placements could be made for clients in the DHS shelter and domestic violence shelter system directly into NYCHA. And then the real crux of the plan is transforming that haphazard system that built up. We took an honest look at the trajectory of the homelessness crisis and what we were seeing in New York City, and we're honest in the fact of what the city was going to need to do in terms of addressing the immediate need in crisis, in terms of opening 90 new shelters. That was based on census projections that we saw. And when I say census, I mean the Department of Homeless Service census, not census in the broader sense of New York City or the country. But looking at the census and what it meant to make sure that there's high quality shelter for individuals who are experiencing homelessness, and to stop the emergency use of commercial hotels and cluster units, which are private rate apartments that the city historically rented, which took those units out of the affordable housing stock, further creating or furthering the affordable housing crisis. We are about 70%, or excuse me, 75% towards our goal of ending the use of clusters. At the high point, there was almost 4,000, it was I think 3,800 units of clusters used across the city. What we did was we partnered with nonprofit affordable housing groups to purchase and rehab those apartments. So they will be permanent affordable housing units for New Yorkers. I don't have the AMI numbers handy for me, but they are at low AMI. We want to make sure that those who have limited resources and the most in need of affordable housing are the ones that are able to access that resource. Additionally, we continue to close the use of commercial hotels. We've targeted the Families with Children system, recognizing that no family should have to spend a significant period of time in a single hotel room rather than a tier 1 shelter apartment that our system is for the families or children system. Some of the hotel work has been disrupted because we have utilized commercial hotels as part of our early and necessary response to address the community spread of COVID throughout this pandemic. DHS opened its first isolation hotel on March 13th of 2020. So we were very quick to open that isolation capacity and then really move quickly to start moving our most vulnerable population from the congregate single adult system into commercial hotels, again, to slow the spread of COVID. Of the 18,000 single adults who reside in shelter on any night in this past year, just doing the math in my head, of the 18,000, approximately 13,000 are currently in commercial hotels. And again, that's to stop the spread of COVID. Prior to the pandemic, we did have about 3,000 single adults in commercial hotels. And that was in part because we've just not been able to keep pace in terms of opening the high quality shelters. And as an emergency basis, have had to go into those commercial hotels to meet our right to shelter obligations. And then, of course, addressing unsheltered New Yorkers who are experiencing homelessness and are on the street, increasing the number of low threshold, what we refer to as stabilization beds, which are beds that individuals who have spent time on the street are able to go directly into. They don't have curfew. There's much less restriction around them. Some of the points that Elena pointed out in terms of things like a curfew, checking in with a case manager, because individuals who have spent time on the street are sometimes most distrustful of institutions and of government. The nonprofit service providers that we work with really work to build their trust, be flexible, and provide a level of care as we're transitioning them to a permanent housing option that will work for them. That could be supportive housing. It could be, access to rental assistance, et cetera. We are making good progress on the Turning the Tide plan. One of the sort of grounding principles was something that was talked about at the beginning of this conversation, was really thinking about the fact that historically shelters have been placed in Black and Brown communities. They've not been placed in communities of wealth and resource across the city. And we've really turned that on its head. I'm not going to say that every community board or district has an equal number of shelters throughout them. That's by no way the case. But we are close to having a shelter in all of the community boards across the city. And so that means that we've engaged in communities that historically have not engaged in these conversations. We've seen and experienced incredibly ugly and harmful and hurtful rhetoric around the service of and to our clients. And I also see it as an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity to, there's always a handful of people, if we're lucky, one if we're not. But there's always somebody in the room who has come because they know that not only is it the right thing to do, but it is the necessary thing to do. And that we all benefit by ensuring that folks' most basic needs are met. And so we continue to do this work. As I mentioned, I was just at CB2 in Manhattan and having a dialogue and conversation with them. I know this group, I had asked some information from Rosa about the community boards that this group predominantly sort of comes from, and wanted to point out, that in each of the boards that members come from, Brooklyn 12, 14, 15, 7, 13, and 6, we have or will have shelters in each of those community boards. Part of our work and commitment under Turning the Tide is really thinking about, the shelter experience and what it means for our clients and the communities that they are a part of and neighbors with it too. And so hearing again the idea of or suggestion to join the cabs, I think is a great one. Members of the community are able to join. It's an opportunity to, build relationships, learn and support neighbors in the shelter, and work with the providers around a range of issues that can come up in the community. So I would be happy to put folks in touch with my Brooklyn Borough Director, Yuri Sanchez, who's on my team. She's the one who, upon working with the community boards, would be looking for folks who might be interested in serving in that capacity. So she would be a great point of contact if that's something that folks in this group are interested in. And I think a couple of other things I want to touch on, which I think are really important and things that I've experienced in my work that I think are worth sharing. You know, the right to shelter was established in the early 80s, and the system and provision of shelter across New York City has changed over time. The prior mayor thought that he could end homelessness in 5 years, which is a noble goal, and I think something that, you know, we should all work with. The provision of resources to meet that goal was never allocated in any meaningful way. I think, again, it's been mentioned, right? The political will needs to be there to solve these problems. And I think we in government can produce, you know, glossy materials and PowerPoints and presentations. But if we're not investing in the tools and resources that we know will impact and change people's lives, at the end of the day, it's a glossy report that's going to end up in the recycling bin at the turn of the administration. And I think, you know, there is a real and true affordable housing crisis in the city. The Department of Social Services has really tried to utilize our social services tools to address the housing crisis. And what I mean by that is, you know, the rental assistance program that I talked about, we've talked also about, or we haven't talked yet about, but one of the things that the Human Resources Administration does is work in the supportive housing world. You know, the mayor made a significant commitment to build 15,000 units of supportive housing over 15 years. The single largest problem with supportive housing is there's just not enough of it. We know that it works. We know that it is a proven solution. And we know that it is desperately needed, not just in New York City, but across the state. Pairing stable, quality housing with social services on site, it's a proven solution. It benefits individuals, who is where our focus should be, but it also benefits us as friends and neighbors and family members and, you know, members and residents of the same city. And so any advocacy around, you know, increasing and, you know, getting more state resources for supportive housing, and that is also incredibly important. The other thing that I just want to mention, well, there's a couple of other things. We talked about the vouchers. We're focused right now on a couple of really important priorities in the state budget. Celina mentioned Senator Kavanaugh's housing voucher access program. That's really important. One of the things that the city is advocating for is, you know, the program's really well designed. As Celina noted, it would extend eligibility to populations who are currently cut out of programs, including New Yorkers who are undocumented, folks who are on fixed incomes like SSI, and really fall between the gaps of established programs. One of the things that we would love to see in that is a direct allocation or provision for administration by the local social services district as well. We believe that targeting these resources to individuals in our shelter system is really important, and to our clients is really important. And so that's one of the things that we're certainly advocating for. We were also really pleased that both houses included language that would increase the state FEPS program to FMR. And the reason why that is important is because one of the concerns that the city has around Intro 146, and I forget when the hearing was in November on the bill, it was some time ago. I testified on behalf of the agency. One of the concerns is the if the city adjusts the city FHEP's rent level, the concern that it creates a disparity between the state and the city voucher program. Right now, those rent levels are sort of married to one another, with the idea that we don't want to create an unnecessary reason for a landlord to choose to accept one voucher over the other, and thereby landlords accepting the more valuable voucher and the city taking on a larger burden of the fiscal cost. And the concern there is very real, because there has been a significant and systematic effort or disinvestment from the state as it relates to housing and homeless services. At one point, and I forget the year, but it was some time ago, New York State contributed a 50-50 cost split to the single adult provision of shelter and the care and services associated with that. Today, currently, it's about 9%. And so the city is largely, carrying the costs here. We also, have made serious investments to historic underfunding across the shelter system, making sure that there's funding for housing specialists, that our families with children system has social workers in it. I mean, things that I think we could all say like, oh, like, how would they not have those things? But again, historic underfunding and disinvestment from these institutions. And so when you see reports like the report that the Comptroller's office recently issued about the ballooning DHS budget, some of it is for very good and well-intended purposes, right? To serve people and make sure that the provision of social services is adequate. So those are a couple of things on the state side that I wanted to mention. And then I also just wanted to mention one other bill that was not included in the state budget, but was included and passed a couple of weeks ago. We saw during COVID, as somebody who works in government, a crumbling of what had been necessary requirements. We saw loosening of restrictions as it related to document requirements, of in-person interviews, of all of these things that, if we're just being honest with ourselves, are barriers to having individuals access the necessary programs and services that we need. We were able to, through advocacy, to obtain waivers from the state for the ways in which we administer a lot of our programs. The state asked for and received waivers as for some of the ways that the SNAP program is administered. And then we advocated for and received waivers as it relates to the cash assistance program. So prior to the COVID pandemic, individuals would have to go into a job center, wait in very long lines, sometimes be treated terribly by employees at job centers, and virtually waste their whole day trying to get help and get cash assistance. Now, because of waivers, individuals are able to apply for and conduct their interview by telephone. Is it perfect? No. It gets back to issues around Wi-Fi and cellular access and the Obama phones that have, not unlimited minutes. And right, there are certainly issues associated with it. But the truth is that now individuals who are in need of help can apply for that assistance, can conduct their interview at their convenience from the comfort of their home, as opposed to having to go into a center. Now, does that mean that a client can't go into a center? Absolutely not. We recognize that some people will want to go into the center, just like some people are going to want to go into the bank and deposit their check in person. Others are going to snap that photo on the phone and be done with it and not think twice about it. But COVID was an opportunity where, because of the fact of, or the requirement of social distancing and us wanting to limit in-person interaction, we saw these things that for decades were, hard and fast rules just quickly crumble. And we still had to collect documents. We still had to, ensure identity. We had to do all of the things, but the premise that people in need were stealing or, conducting fraud, no, right? And so we can see a different world now, because we've been not now, but we've been operating that different world for the past year. And so we were pleased that the Senate and the House, or not the House, excuse me, the Senate and the Assembly passed a bill that would make that telephone interview waiver permanent, that would allow clients to continue to apply for benefits online and conduct that interview by telephone. It provides the local social service district the option, but the New York State Association of Counties wrote a memo of support. NYPWA, the New York Public Welfare Association, wrote a memo of support. So we are hopeful that the governor will sign it, but we're waiting for him to call that bill up. And we're seeing if there's not a way that we can't get the legislature to deliver it in the meantime, because we think that it's vitally important. I think I'll leave it there. I feel like I'm probably at 15 minutes. If I went over, I do apologize, but I look forward to answering some questions, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity to share this together tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin. Yeah, I see that Celina will be unable to stay much longer, but thank you for staying as long as you did.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I gotta run to another. It's a long day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Good
Okay.
night.
Bye. Yeah, no, this is great. I think that a bunch of us are here, so I'm happy to stay on till 9 p.m. to moderate, you know, a little Q&A for anyone who has questions. Does anyone have a question currently that would like to start? I know I have one. No. Okay, I'm going to ask my question because, as Erin said, there are shelters slated, or there are shelters that will definitely come up in all of our community boards in our groups area, and the reason why this panel came about really was because our group has been just dismayed, to put it mildly, by our city council, well, my city councilman, Chaim Deutsch, who was one of the very vocal opponents to this shelter scheduled for 100 Neptune Avenue in Brighton Beach. We just found out the news that the vendor for that shelter has pulled out, if I understand that correctly. Okay.
Yeah, so DHS enters into contracts with nonprofit social service providers who respond to an open-ended RFP, because the need for shelter is unfortunately ongoing at this point. In order to meet the right to shelter obligations, we have an open-ended RFP, unlike some RFPs that, you know, are open for a period of time, you respond and then it's done. So when a nonprofit service provider responds to the RFP, part of the process is that they have to demonstrate site control. So they have to demonstrate that the owner, the landlord, is understanding of what the provider is going to do there. In this instance, the developer or the landlord no longer wanted to work with the provider. And so we're waiting. We continue from an agency point of view to believe that this is a good location for a shelter to be built. And so we are waiting for a new provider to submit an RFP that would then go through the rating and approval process for us to be able to move forward at this site.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, I believe CORE is the provider.
Yeah, right. So they submitted the RFP, and then the developer is no longer interested in working with them.
I see.
Yeah.
So another provider could submit an RFP and potentially that shelter would be developed.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so there are times where property owners will bring sites to us, and we'll work with our providers to see if anybody is interested in a particular site. So again, once we have a rated and approved proposal, we'll come back to the community board and let the the elected officials know of the change. I believe it was yesterday, Yuri, who I mentioned before, Brooklyn Borough Director, she called the electeds to let them know of that change. And I think the Brooklyn paper might have written about it.
I know that
I can't remember. I think some local paper might have written about it. If not, I think they might.
I believe Steven Simberwitz, who's my representative, announced it. At least that's how we learned about it.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
But I know that a major concern about that site was the fact that it had previously been an automotive repair shop, maybe. So there were environmental concerns, and my understanding was that the city would still require the provider to do remediation on the site to make it safe. I just want to point out too that concern about the environmental concerns, like, I believe I read a comment to someone who was supportive of the shelter was like, we have homeless people living on this site now. So to be concerned about, to have the concern that they might be living there in a shelter doesn't speak to the fact that they're living there now.
Yeah, no, and the agency is required to undergo environmental assessment and conduct all the requisite procedures or requisite work in terms of getting approvals to make sure that any site is safe to open, that it's compliant with DOB, FDNY, our state oversight entity, OTDA. So there's a good deal of checks and balances in terms of making sure, because we don't want to open a site that could provide an unhealthy environment because of any environmental issues or concerns. But I'll just note, I mean, I've heard and I'm just going to call it an excuse of why a shelter shouldn't go in one particular location or another. It's too far from the subway. It's too close to the subway. It's across the street from a school. It needs to be closer, like everything.
It really drove the point home for me when Celina said that her own or a community board area district or her own neighborhood had 12 to 13 shelters.
Yeah, Rosa, actually, I sent you a document. I'm not tech savvy enough because of the way that my work computer works, but I sent you a document that actually is a visual representation of DHS's footprint. And if you want to put that up on the screen, it is just, it's an interesting data metric. And Elena, to some of the maps that you cited earlier, you could overlay those almost perfectly.
Yeah. Oh my. Well, this group really loves data. I'll tell you that much. And so we'll
so this is a map that represents the DHS footprint as of December 31st, 2020. So we have, since this time, we've announced a shelter in the 2 Staten Island boards that are gray. And then we've also announced a shelter in Bronx 11, that's gray up at the top. And then Brooklyn 11 we've announced. And
so this is very interesting. This actually shows the gray areas are where there's 0 shelters.
That's right.
Wow.
Well, except the ones that I just rattled off, that because now we're 3 months later, the data lags in terms of us doing this, but
the disparities are very clear here. Like CD 1626 for the DHS shelters.
Yeah, if you go up to the Bronx, I think it's Bronx 4. Yeah, Bronx 4 is 26 also.
Right. Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, when I started my work with the agency 6 years ago, a little over 6 years ago, even my own perception around things has, you know, when I saw the information, but if you look at like the numbers of shelters in Manhattan, there are, you know, a significant number. It tends to be in Upper Manhattan, as you might imagine. Yeah, please feel free to distribute that to your folks if folks are interested in that.
Do we have any other questions? Or
I have a question actually for Erin. Are there ways, so I understand the community advisory board, is it true that that's really once the shelter is up and running, or are there ways for neighbors or community members to start to kind of support while it's in its still developmental?
Yeah, thank you for that. So unlike the past administration, under the Turning the Tide plan, we have made a commitment to meet with communities before the shelter opens. So we've been averaging about 200 days between the time that we notify a community to the time that the shelter opens. The reason why there's just such a gap is because you know, some of this is ground up, it's an average, right? So some of this is ground up development. Some of it is like just internal rehab of buildings. But we, you know, we have made a commitment that the relationship with the community is really important. And so typically what happens is when we have the contract, we will then do notification calls to the local elected officials, to the community board, and let them know. And then typically what will happen, although it depends on the neighborhood for sure, is we'll hold a meeting with the community board, a public meeting. And those meetings are really important, especially for voices that are in support of our homeless neighbors, because they tend to be few and far between. Those meetings are less about exchanges of facts and information and more really troubling sessions about people's misconceptions, fear, racism. But we go in the attempt to share facts and information. So having voices who are supportive in those rooms is really helpful. So that's one. We saw something unique develop over the course of the summer. I won't call it unique, but I think it was the sort of most robust example of this that I've seen in the time that I've been with the agency. And it's not to say that there are others and, you know, just are quietly flying under the radar. But this summer there was a very public engagement around a sighting of a hotel on the Upper West Side at the Lucerne. And the debate around the use of this hotel has really persisted for months now. But one thing that we saw was a group form to really support the men who were at the shelter and build inroads in ways that was lasting. It started out as sort of, you know, a counter protest to the protest of the shelter, but really quickly morphed into meaningful relationships where, you know, families would just sort of engage in dialogue and support these men in their neighborhood. And we saw other groups like that spring up again in the use of, in response to our use of hotels. So that group was called Open Hearts Upper West Side. There's Open Hearts FIDI. I think that model is really great because one of the things that I didn't touch on in my presentation is that while gentrification changes housing stability across the city, it also changes the experience of our shelters and what it means for individuals who are in our shelters, some of which our shelters have been there for a very long time. One of our assessment facilities is in a neighborhood that, you know, has faced some very significant and serious gentrification over the past couple of years. And you have long-term residents who are part of the CAB who will praise the agency. Things are getting so much better. The work that you're doing is really great. Thank you for the investment and, you know, services to our clients. And then you have newer residents to the neighborhood who are saying the exact opposite. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? This is an atrocity. And so irony of us sort of also experiencing the impacts of gentrification. But I will say that those open heart groups are really great. And, you know, we see a lot of community support around the holidays, but figuring out ways to make sort of lasting relationships with the shelter, I think is something else to think about and consider as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I mean, I would hope that we could, like, I'm in one of the neighborhoods that shelters, the Neptune.
I'm gonna,
Council Member Deutsch and his very regressive approach to the shelter is very disturbing.
if
So-
anyone's looking for, if anyone's ever interested in watching a council hearing, he was quite rude during the preliminary budget hearing
He has a
with the
reputation.
commissioner.
Yeah, he has we have a whole history with him. So
I put my email address in the chat. So if anyone's interested in cabs or getting connected to these open heart groups, I'd be happy to make a connection and certainly also connect you to Yuri, Brooklyn Borough Director, who, like I said, helps organize and facilitates and participates in the cabs.
Yeah, that would be great.
yes, I mean, I know I personally will be in touch, and this group will be in touch for sure.
Great.
That sounds so amazing. And we're for 9 p.m. So I thank you for everyone who stayed and the people who left, but thank you. Like, you're not here to hear my thank you. Just want to read this comment from Jess Byrne, who's one of our members and sits on our executive committee. I feel so much camaraderie with you all, coming from a public ed advocacy background, including with regards to Heim Deutsch. Yeah, Jess has stories. But thank you, everyone. Honestly, I just feel like this is really the beginning of the dialogue and the collaboration and the ideas. So, you know, really glad to put faces to everyone and just make space for this, make time for this.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Rhonda, for
Thank you.
moderating, and thank you to all of our panelists.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.